a young woman would be found brutally murdered, and 17 years later, police would be shocked to learn that she was just the beginning. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tina Jefferson. Viewer discretion is advised. Just a heads up, there are going to be a lot of people I'm talking about in this video, and unfortunately, I cannot find enough information on pretty much most of them. Veronica Tina Jefferson, and she would go by Tina throughout her life. She was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, and she went to and graduated from Eisenhower High School. She was a member of the National Honor Society there. She would go on to be president of her sorority, and this was at Oklahoma State University. And then, after that, she got a job with the CIA. Yeah. So she moved to Washington, D.C., the Virginia area, and she loved doing what she did. She was an analyst there. Specifically, I guess, in the accounting department. It's gotta be pretty cool, though, just to say you work with the CIA. Kind of jealous. Her mom would describe her as definitely a mama's girl, that even as an adult, in her early 20s, she would still come and jump on, her mom's lap and just give her a big hug, and she was just a sweet, kind person. Unfortunately, it seems to be primarily the sweet, kind people who horrible things happen to. By May of 1988, Tina Jefferson was 24 years old. In the early morning hours of May 11th, 1988, this is approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, behind McKinley Elementary School, which is in Arlington, Virginia, a body would be discovered, which they would eventually determine was the body of Tina Jefferson. Tina had been shot to death. Her clothes had been taken off of her body. They were not ripped off. The officers made note of that. So this didn't appear to be to them like a struggle or the person who did it ripped them off of her in an act of rage. They almost thought maybe she took them off herself, possibly. Maybe thinking that she knew this person. That was just a theory. But they did determine that she was actually sexually assaulted, and then she was shot afterwards, and then just left there. Left on the property of an elementary school as well. It's great. What if kids were the ones who discover her? Then again, I don't think the killer would actually care. Something police could not find right away was her car, but that would be discovered the following day. She drove a little red Camaro, and her car was actually parked in the parking lot of, I guess, a store called the Giant Supermarket, and that's near Columbia Pike. Basically, it's a store she shopped at a lot, and she literally lived just down the street from the store. When police found her car, they, of course, did extensive, evidence checks on it. They dusted it for fingerprints, and they determined that the car was likely completely wiped down because they found no fingerprints. Police did find a receipt in her car for the Giant Supermarket, and it was time-stamped around 9:30 p.m., so police go to the store and they begin to question everyone who was working there that night. Police were working under the theory that she had come into contact with her killer at the store, and then maybe took off in another vehicle with this person and left her car behind. They were a little suspicious about that theory, though, because Tina's purse and all of her belongings, like her cash and everything, were still in her car. And nothing was stolen. They did also find a box cutter in her car, which was not something she owned. And it didn't, because I know a lot of supermarkets, a lot of retail stores also use box cutters, so they kind of looked at the box cutters that the supermarket used, and it wasn't the same type, so it was a different box cutter. But that also yielded no physical evidence, no fingerprints or anything. But after interviewing a whole bunch of employees, there were several people who said, yep, we definitely saw her in the store. I mean, they recognize her. She's there all the time. She did not ever appear to look like she was in distress. She was smiling. She was in her normal mood. They would also run basically a DNA comparison because they did collect some male bodily fluid from Tina's body, and they ran that DNA against all of the male employees in the store. And at this time, it wasn't super extensive testing, but they could kind of narrow down to like blood types, and also I guess the DNA for what was left behind with Tina had a very rare, I guess, aspect to it that only occurs in 4% of people. And none of the men from the grocery store had that kind of profile, and none of them were a match. They also ran a DNA against all of the male people in her life, friends, possibly exes, matched absolutely no one. A couple of days after she was murdered, a police officer came forward to say that he thinks he saw Tina that night. This officer stated that at approximately 9:45 or so, he believes he saw Tina's red Camaro driving kind of, not erratically, but sort of kind of swerving a little bit. And then he noticed the car take a very sharp right turn, and it like ran over a curb. He was able to tell from his car that whoever was driving was yelling at someone in the passenger seat. There was like an argument going on. And then, I guess, she stops the car, she gets out, she again goes to the passenger side of the car and starts to talk to someone in her car. And she gets back in. He didn't see the car pull away, but he decided at that point, they're not doing anything illegal, so he just sort of left the area. Tina's friends did give police the names of a couple of people who may have been possible troublesome individuals in her life. Police questioned them. They got DNA from them. No match. They also, I believe, tested that police officer, by the way. Not a match. Then in May of 1989, this is a year later, a couple would go to police to say that they think they saw Tina at the store that night. The husband went to the deli counter to get some stuff, and he says he saw Tina there originally by herself, and then he saw an African-American man walk up next to her and starts talking to her. He said based on what he can remember, the body language and the conversation did not appear that the two of them had actually known each other prior to this. That this was like just a random dude who saw a beautiful woman and decided to like hit on her. Then the wife of this guy later on in the parking lot saw Tina and this unknown man talking next to Tina's car. Interestingly enough, the officer who saw Tina that night, he said that it appeared based on body language and the tone of voice that Tina was giving to the unknown person in the car. He said it appeared they absolutely knew each other. So you have like these two contradicting witnesses, one saying they knew each other, that looked like, and one saying it didn't look like the two of them knew each other. Regardless, the couple who saw Tina, they gave police a description of the man, and they came up with a composite drawing, and they described as a young African-American male. They guessed that he was a little over 6 foot tall, approximately 170, 180 pounds. He had a bigger build, like a bodybuilder type thing, they said, but police never found anyone who matched that description. And unfortunately, Tina's case went cold. It appears to be possibly a stranger-on-stranger crime, or a tiff between people who did know each other. And that causes a problem with the investigation, because it's like we have to now go in two different directions to try to find this person. But they had no luck either way. It wouldn't be until 2000 when there was an update on the case. So basically what they did was they took the DNA found on Tina and they put it into the system, and they found a hit, not towards a suspect, but towards other victims. The DNA found on Tina matched DNA that was found on another woman whose name was Rachel Raver. On December 6th, 1988, this is several months after Tina's murder, there were people, hunters or something, walking around this wooded area that was described as an area that was completely out of the way, an area that people would rarely ever go into. But as these people are searching around, they find a body, and it was a female whose clothing had been removed, and she had been shot to death. When police arrive and they begin searching the area, they're basically putting the caution tape up, and as they're doing so, they find another body. And this is a body of a man lying on his stomach, fully clothed. He too had a gunshot wound to his head. They would be identified as 22-year-old Rachel Raver and her 22-year-old boyfriend, Warren Fulton. This, by the way, is in Reston, Virginia. so not too far from where Tina was found. Warren Fulton was the captain of the George Washington University baseball team. He had dreamt of one day making the majors. Rachel had actually graduated from the same school just shortly before this happened. She planned to eventually become a lawyer because her next step in the educational process was law school. So police would track down the friends of Rachel and Warren, and they wanted to get like a timeline. The last time that anyone saw Rachel and Warren alive was actually on the evening of December 3rd, 1988, 3 days before they're found. Rachel and Warren were actually at a bar in Washington, D.C. with their friends, and they left the bar together, Rachel and Warren, around 12:30 in the morning. So police again look into their lives, look for possible exes. They look for any people in their lives who may be considered enemies. But once again, kind of like Tina, there is nothing. There's nothing nefarious in their lives. There's no jilted lovers, no quarrels going on, nothing. And so it's like, is this another stranger on stranger incident? And what was the motive? Well, it was sexual. Because police believe that whoever did this somehow came across Rachel and Warren that night, obviously, and pointed a gun at them and basically forced them to drive from D.C. to where eventually they were found in Virginia, which was, by the way, was behind, like, they're found, I guess, behind a church. In that kind of wooded area behind a church. But no one can recall hearing gunshots. No one can recall hearing screams. No one saw anything around that church. No one saw anything around the area that night. But it's believed that that's where the two were killed. Police think that Warren had to have been shot first because Warren's, the big guy. He's not the target. Rachel is, because it's sexually motivated crime here. So he just shoots Warren in the head, and then they believe because Rachel had a gunshot wound that was non-fatal to another part of her body, so it's believed that the killer shot her there first, sexually assaulted her, and then shot her in the head to finish her off. It does seem that Rachel, based on that Rachel had tried to run away after her boyfriend was just shot, and that's why the guy shot her somewhere else to get her to stop. And kind of like with Tina, Rachel's car also was missing. But it wouldn't be until 6 weeks later when her car was found. And the only reason why it was found is because Rachel's mom got a letter in the mail. It was a ticket for Rachel's car because the car had been found basically parked but burnt to a crisp. And it was found all the way in Queens, New York. And believe it or not, that car had been left there just the day after the murders. But apparently it wasn't ticketed for quite some time, or the mom just didn't get the ticket for quite some time, but it just sat there burnt. It was completely just hollowed out because whatever fire damage just annihilated everything. So there was no evidence in it, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. But there was DNA left on Rachel, which they collected, and that's how they eventually would, in 2000, they would match. They would get that connection between Rachel and Tina. And it was actually Rachel's mom who saw Tina's case being covered on Unsolved Mysteries. And that's really how these got linked. That's how the DNA finally matched, because the mom felt this was the same type of thing. And at first, police were like, no, because, Rachel and Warren, they're white, Tina is black. Can't be the same person. What? That's not a thing. And so finally when that DNA came back, police were like, oh, okay, I guess it is the same. Yeah, no, okay, thanks. So now there's a confirmed serial killer out there. His DNA still isn't matching to a person that committed these crimes. We just know at this point that there is a connection between three people. Now, the next portion of this is going to be about a few more victims who there's really no obituaries for. I only have pictures of a couple of them. Unfortunately, some of them, the stuff is just hard to find. On September 2nd, 1989, near Prince William Forest Park in Virginia, the body of 27-year-old Manuel Cermeno was found. He was found shot to death and inside of his vehicle that was on fire. He had been dead before the fire, And this was along the I-95. Unfortunately, he's one of the victims I don't have a photo for and I don't have much info on. But as of back in 1989, this was just what appeared to be a random homicide, and there was almost no evidence, nothing to go by. On May 5th, 1990. Now, we're in Rubidoux, California. So we're all the way across the country. 19-year-old Stacy Segrist and 21-year-old Tony Giannuzzi, both of them were found shot to death. And Stacy had also been sexually assaulted, and there was DNA left behind on her. Now, because this is all the way in California and these other cases had taken place in Virginia, this is the late 80s. There was no big, nationwide system in place to plug in information and say, yep, this matches that case in California. That hadn't existed yet. On June 2nd, 1990, 2 more bodies are found. 71-year-old Lula Farley and her 65-year-old husband, Herbert Farley, they were found shot to death. Well, actually, Lula was found shot to death first, and then a couple of weeks later, her husband was found shot to death. What happened to them, and this is now in Ontario, California, apparently Lula and Herbert would collect, recyclable stuff, behind, supermarkets, in the recycling bins and dumpsters. So apparently, what it appeared to have happened, based on what witnesses heard, was that there was some sort of altercation that took place behind a supermarket. I don't know exactly how police came to this conclusion, but I guess Lula and Herbert were behind a grocery store, and it's believed that the 2 of them had been abducted by someone, because they had been reported missing. But then they were clearly taken away from that area, and then Lula was found shot to death in one location, and then 2 weeks later Herbert was found. And then, on September 2nd, 1990, there was another victim. This was the youngest victim. Her name was Yvette Woodruff. A man named Alfredo Prieto, along with a few accomplices, Vincent Lopez and Danny Sorian, they robbed a man named Anthony Rangella. Then they basically kidnapped Anthony after robbing him. They drove Anthony to, I guess, another location where Anthony's aunt lived. And also Anthony's niece lived. And so when all of these men got there, they took all of these people hostage and robbed them, but then would end up taking someone from the house. And that was the 15-year-old friend of the niece who lived in the house, and the friend was Yvette Woodruff. The group of men took the 3 women from the house and put them into their car, and then took off with the intent of sexually assaulting them. They brought the women to this abandoned location, this desolate area, where they sexually assaulted them. And then 2 of the men had stabbed the aunt and the niece, but both of those women would survive. Alfredo, he had a gun, and he shot Yvette, and that killed her. Later that day, people would find the 3 women, including the body of the 15-year-old girl. Police would get information from an informant about someone who had confessed to them, this informant, about committing this crime or being a part of it. And that's how police were led to Alfredo Prieto. And then his accomplices were all arrested as well. Now, Prieto was charged with first-degree murder, robbery, kidnapping, and in January of 1992, a jury found him guilty of all charges, and he was sentenced to death. I don't know the exact outcome of his accomplices. I just know that they were arrested and charged. I haven't done a deep dive into them, but they don't have anything to do with the remainder of this case. It wouldn't be until 2005 when DNA that had been on Tina Jefferson, Rachel Raver, Stacy Segrist, and Yvette Woodruff, they were all finally connected. And then in 2005, I don't know why it didn't happen sooner, because he was in jail the entire time. I don't know. But in 2005, that all of those DNA profiles, because now we have a nationwide database that can match cases from California and cases in Virginia, there was a hit for one man committing those 4 sexual assaults and likely murders, and that was Alfredo Prieto. Now, there wasn't DNA left with Manuel Cermeno or with the murders of Lula and Herbert, but ballistics were collected from all of the crime scenes, right? And To those who don't know, there is a pretty extensive database for firearms and bullets that are used in, criminal cases. And they're stored, and so they would look at the bullets that were used to shoot Yvette. Because now the DNA is linking them, they can determine that it was the same gun that killed Tina, Rachel, Warren, Stacy, and Tony. But then they also got hits with that ammunition on a couple other cases. Manuel Cermeno and Lula and Herbert. The bullets were the exact same ones. They were fired from the exact same gun that police now know for sure belonged to Alfredo. And so he had now been charged not just with and sentenced for, Yvette's murder way back when, but now he's being charged with 8 more murders. Police had no evidence linking any other person being involved in any of the other murders other than the last one that got him caught. Alfredo Prieto was born in San Salvador on November 18th, 1965, and he was one of 6 kids. It's, I guess, reported that he grew up with a very poor family. They did not have much money. Food was hard to come by. Resources in general were hard to come by. His dad was very abusive physically, not just with his wife, but with the kids. And so the mom would basically take the kids and leave the country, and then they would come to the United States. By 1981, they had moved to the Pomona, California area, and that's where Alfredo and his siblings would go to school. He would attend and graduate from Pomona High School, but also Alfredo became very much into drugs and alcohol, and then he joined a gang, and then his life of crime basically began at a pretty young age. I guess in 1984, so at this point, he's actually married to a woman named Sandra. They go on to have a kid together. They had moved to the Ontario area, and I guess Alfredo thought his wife was cheating on him. So Alfredo did what any reasonable person would do, right? He got a gun and he shot 3 people. Yeah. One of the men was someone he thought was having an affair with his wife, which turned out not to be true. But then I guess he just shot the other 2 men because they were there, but none of them died. He was arrested and charged for the shootings, but police said, they were gang members anyway. Who cares? And he only spent 3 years in jail for it. And then by 1987, 1988, after he got out, he moved to Arlington, Virginia, and that's actually where his dad had moved to. His dad had been convicted of murder back in El Salvador, and after he was released for his murder, that's when he moved to the States. So, and then, I guess, reunited with son. Yeah, yay. During one of his trials, it would be discovered that Alfredo had repeatedly sexually assaulted and abused his wife that he had for a brief time. And then in 1989, dear old dad is arrested for committing a sexual assault on a woman, and he is put back in prison in the States this time. And then, this is around the time when Alfredo decided to go on to start his murderous rampage, with Tina Jefferson being his first victim that they know of. And then after committing 4 murders there, he moved to California, where he committed 5 more. What a guy. 9 murders between 1988 and 1990 across 2 states, Virginia and California. He had attempted to murder 3 more people at least when he shot those 3 men. He had sexually abused his wife and likely other women, they believe. This guy just not a good dude ever, basically. Let me give you the list of things that this man was convicted of. First-degree murder with special circumstances. 3 counts of kidnapping. 3 counts of forcible sexual assault. 2 counts of robbery. 2 counts of attempted robbery. Possession of a firearm by a felon. Oh, that's just California. In Virginia, he was convicted of capital murder, sexual assault, grand larceny, grand theft auto, use of a firearm and commission of a felony. And he basically got a couple more death sentences thrown in there just for good measure. He got the death penalty in California, and he got the death penalty in Virginia. On October 1st, 2015, at 9:17 p.m., Alfredo Prieto was executed by lethal injection. And he left behind 9 bodies. 9 people with families, with Wives, husbands, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, friends, so many people affected by what this man did. For every murder, it isn't just one victim. It's everyone who was a part of that victim. They're also victims. They have to live with that pain forever. All because one man, what was the overall motive with him? Was it robbery? Was it sexual assault? Could be all sorts of things. But clearly he just was not wired right from the get-go. But the evidence spoke for itself. You cannot deny DNA. And this guy was a monster. One of the worst monsters that honestly I had never heard of until I started looking into this. He's not one of the names, he's not a Bundy or a Gacy or a Dahmer, but he is just as bad. A California community would be rocked by a brutal homicide committed by one of the most unlikeliest of suspects. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Kirsten Costas. Viewer discretion is advised. It was the evening of June 23rd, 1984, in the community of Orinda, California. Orinda at that time was considered a very affluent community, a well-respected community where violence just wasn't really a thing, especially not murder. Well, on that summer night in 1984, a man named Alex Arnold opens his door to a young girl who is knocking on his door. That young girl was Kirsten Costas, a high school student, with her very notable and distinctive curly hair, with a big, bright smile. Well, that particular evening, she seemed a little put off by something. When she knocked on her neighbor's door, she asked if she could get a ride back to her home. She had just been at a party at a local church, and she had tried calling her parents, but her parents unfortunately didn't answer. And so she went to go knock on the house of a person she knows. And so this Alex Arnold person gets into the car with Kirsten and takes her home. Something that Mr. Arnold notices almost right away is that tailing just behind them was a Pinto. Someone driving a Pinto seemed to be following them around. So they finally get to Kirsten's street, and Mr. Arnold pulls up to Kirsten's neighbor's house, because Kirsten lived right across the street. Kirsten gets out of her car, thanks Mr. Arnold, and she begins to walk towards her house. But then he notices that someone in this Pinto stops the car as well, gets out. They're dressed in some sort of trench coat and a hat, and they begin to approach Kirsten and chase her. Kirsten then runs towards her neighbor's front door, but this person in this trench coat immediately takes out a knife and just stabs Kirsten numerous times. This all happened in a matter of seconds, and Kirsten's screams could be heard all over the neighborhood, including, the person who lived in this house, a person who knew Kirsten. They lived across the street from her. He goes outside and he sees Kirsten now on the ground covered in blood. Her assailant has run back to her Pinto, gets in and takes off. And Mr. Arnold, who's still in his car, decides to try to chase or follow this Pinto while the other neighbor is tending to Kirsten. The neighbor who is tending to her, his son calls 911 as all of this is happening. When an ambulance arrives and they take her to the hospital, Kirsten had at least 5 stab wounds in her. Within an hour of arriving at the hospital, 15-year-old Kirsten Costas would be pronounced deceased. Mr. Arnold, who had been trying to pursue the Pinto, somehow they got turned around and they ended up losing the Pinto. They don't know where it went. And so Mr. Arnold then pulls back up to the house where Kirsten had been stabbed. Some people took notice of this and go, oh, what's that about? We saw this car here earlier and now the car is back. And so Mr. Arnold was immediately questioned by police, like, what are you doing here? And he told them the story about what happened. And it sounds like the neighbor who came out to check on Kirsten can confirm, this visually what he saw, that this person who was driving the car, Mr. Arnold, was not the person who stabbed Kirsten. It was obvious to the witnesses that this individual who stabbed Kirsten was a woman, a female. But who on earth would have done this to her? Kirsten was born on July 23rd, 1968. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom, and her father was, I believe, an executive at the 3M company in San Francisco. And Kirsten lived there with her parents and her brother in the affluent community of Orinda. Kirsten attended Miramonte High School, and she was an incredibly popular girl there. She was well-known, well-liked, well-respected. She never had any issues making friends. She had this kind of core group of 4 other girls that were her friends, and Kirsten participated in school sports, and she was also a cheerleader. Kirsten was just simply put your prototypical all-American teenage girl. She represented kind of like what it was to be a teenage girl in the 80s. You know, not without her flaws. I mean, being a cheerleader, sometimes you can get kind of painted as almost like too popular, maybe stuck up, or maybe a little like mean girl-ish, but Kirsten didn't really fall into that particular category. And because everyone in high school really liked her, and she was popular and well-known, it was either going to be very easy to find a suspect or very difficult. That's even if the killer was someone from her school. And that was the job the police had to figure out. They learned that on that afternoon, that Kirsten's mom answered a phone call. The call came from what sounded like another young teenage girl who was from a group called the Bobolinks at the high school. It was basically sort of similar to a sorority in a college, but this was a volunteer program at the high school. And if you were a part of it, you were a part of a very special clique there in school. And Kirsten and a couple of her friends were invited to join the Bobolinks. And so this phone call that her mom took that day said, hey, we're having this little potluck get-together thing, and we would like to know if, you could tell Kirsten that she's invited. That same evening, however, there's also a little pool party type thing going on at this nearby church, which is what Kirsten ends up attending. And then a couple of hours later, she is murdered on the front lawn of her neighbor's home. A lot of theories kind of surrounded this community. There was at one point, they floated out this theory that, Kirsten kind of was sort of like a representation, like I said earlier, of what it was like to be a teenage girl in the 80s, but she was also a representation of Orinda, California as a whole. This very kind of wealthy, well-to-do community, and there were people outside of it who resented this type of community. And there was this idea thrown out there that maybe someone killed Kirsten because she was a well-known member of the community, and they wanted to stick it to the community by killing one of them. But that would have been a very difficult theory to confirm. And eventually it got down to a point where it sounded like, because police had interviewed hundreds of people, they interviewed all of her friends, all the people who were at that party that night. They interviewed, obviously, her family, everyone they can think of, and to figure out, who may have wanted to do this. And ultimately, police were having a really hard time kind of figuring it out. So they would enlist the help of the FBI, and that's when an FBI profiler becomes involved. And I will never understand how profiling actually works and how it's always, not always, but usually so effective and so accurate. I don't get it. I don't understand it. But there are people who do, including profilers. And so the FBI profile took everything, like, for example, the weapon that was used, a knife. A knife is something that is very personal, and it's meant to cause pain. And so they took that, and they took many other aspects of the crime, the victim, and they came up with this profile that whoever killed Kirsten almost completely likely knew her and knew her well. As a matter of fact, the profile said that she was probably a friend of Kirsten's, someone who also did not come from a well-to-do, wealthy family like Kirsten did. Someone who was in a part of a big family with a lot of siblings. This person was probably between the ages of 16 to 18 years old or so. And so that helped everyone narrow it down to, oh my God, this was a fellow student who killed her. So through investigating people closest to her, they would talk to a friend named Bernadette Prati, who would end up giving police an alibi. But police, during the initial part of this investigation, did not verify a lot of these alibis. including Bernadette's. When the profile was released to the public, Bernadette's mom read about it in the paper, and that scared Bernadette. She would end up writing a letter to her mom. She told her mom, please wait 30 minutes before you open this letter and read it. And her mom did just that. Bernadette left the house. Her mom set a timer for 30 minutes, and when that timer went up, she opened the letter from Bernadette. Bernadette Proddy was a good friend of Kirsten's. They were part of the same group of girls who were close. Bernadette had tried out for the cheerleading squad, like sometime a few months prior to this, but she was denied. Bernadette was popular, but she wasn't as popular as Kirsten and some of her other friends. Bernadette felt like because she did not come from the same type of family, that she felt like, I'm not on their level. But she wanted to be on their level. At any rate, Bernadette's mom opens this letter. It's a confession letter. Her daughter, Bernadette, confesses to stabbing and murdering Kirsten Costas. Bernadette would also admit that she was the one who called Kirsten's mom that evening and invited her to this Bobolinks thing, which turns out wasn't even happening. It was a lie. That was Bernadette's way of luring Kirsten out of the house. Bernadette's mom is obviously just like completely gutted and shocked by this letter. And eventually it leads to police arresting Bernadette because she flat out confessed. And then when she sat down with police, she would also tape a confession that she was the one to do it. In this taped confession, Bernadette at one point said to police, quote, "Do I have to go back to Miramonte, the high school? I can't live if it is known. I would rather die." End quote. So she's thinking that despite her confessing to a murder, she's going to actually be able to go back to school, which she didn't want to do. But they're like, no, you've killed someone. You're under arrest. So at this church gathering at the party, Bernadette, I guess, approached Kirsten. They were having a conversation, just talking like friends. The conversation of Bernadette not making the cheerleading squad, and she was also denied to be on the yearbook team, said she told Kirsten that she was upset by this. She was mad. She was upset that she wasn't as popular as Kirsten and the other girls. And I guess at some point there's this vibe, or maybe Kirsten says it, but something along the lines that Bernadette felt that Kirsten thought Bernadette was extremely weird, that she was being very strange, very weird. And that is what set Bernadette off. Bernadette did not want the rest of the school to know she was weird, apparently. That Bernadette was maybe a little stalkerish, maybe a little creepy. And this is actually confirmed because when Kirsten first spoke to Mr. Arnold, the guy who gave her the ride back to her street, she actually told Mr. Arnold, yeah, I was just with a friend who was acting very weird. She said to him that this friend went weird. So she ends up basically following Kirsten home that night. She stalks her basically as she goes to the neighbor's house to ask for a ride. And she ends up getting into her Pinto, which is confirmed that Bernadette owns a Pinto, or her family does, and that's what she was driving that night. So that can corroborate the fact that Mr. Arnold saw this Pinto kind of driving closely behind him as they were going back to Kirsten's neighborhood. And then as Kirsten was beginning to cross the street to go towards her house, that's when Bernadette got out and basically chased her back, and stabbed her. Now, Bernadette says that this murder wasn't planned. This was not premeditated. That the knife just so happened to be in the car at that time. This was a shared vehicle. And later on, Bernadette's sister would go on the stand at trial and say, well, yeah, I usually would keep a large knife in my car to cut fruits and vegetables, to snack on. The prosecutors and the police thought that was extremely odd because this wasn't like this was like a butcher's knife. This is a big knife. It's not it's not like it's impossible. It's just strange that someone would keep a large butcher knife in their car for cutting fruits and vegetables. And police also would verify that Bernadette's alibi that she gave initially that was not investigated from the get-go turned out not to be true, and that she had no alibi for the time of the murder. So Bernadette is arrested and charged with murder, and the prosecution wanted to go for first-degree murder, that this was a planned thing. The trial of Bernadette lasts about 3 days or so, but the prosecution was never able to establish that this truly was premeditated. they were only able to really prove that this was a murder that happened kind of just in the heat of the moment. But you also have, like, why did Bernadette lure or attempt to lure Kirsten out of her home for this non-existent bobolinks get together? There was also something else she brought up that because that night Bernadette did actually pick Kirsten up to go to this gathering that they eventually went to, and she says at one point Kirsten offered her pot or marijuana, and Bernadette said no. She said I just didn't want to do it, and she made me feel dumb for not wanting to do it. And so that, I guess, also led into this it's strange, because you have elements that she may have been planning something, but was it murder per se? And it does sound like it stemmed from this conversation she had with Kirsten at this little pool party thing, where Kirsten was basically saying Bernadette is weird, and Bernadette didn't want to be known as the weird girl at school. She didn't want to be known as trying to become too involved in this big friends group or whatever. I don't know. I don't get it. But that is what set her off. And so she ends up following Bernadette back home, and apparently in the heat of the moment stabs her with a knife that was apparently already in the car. And so the only thing the prosecution was truly able to prove was second-degree murder, that this was an unplanned murder. Bernadette Proddy was convicted and sentenced to just 9 years in prison, in which she only served 7. She was 16 at the time of the trial, and so this is all happening under, she's a minor. And so usually when a minor commits a crime, you get a much, much less sentence because you're a kid. Some of you know my feelings about this, and I'll say it again. If you are a human who knowingly and willingly commits a murder, you should be treated equally as everyone else. Sorry, but you should be punished just as badly as everyone else does. Because it almost is telling kids, like, hey, you can go kill someone. You're not going to get in that much trouble. You go to jail for a couple of years, but then you get right back out and still live the rest of your life. That's what you're telling kids. Like, it's okay to just go out there and murder. Oh, and then they go, oh, but I'm a kid. I can't, I didn't know any better. Bernadette stabbed this girl and then left her to die. Stabbed her 5 times. Stalked her on her way home, stabbed her 5 times, and left her to die on that person's front yard, and then fled the scene. That is cold and calculated. She knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing as she stabbed Kirsten. Stabbed her once. Okay, oh my God, what am I doing? And then another time, then another time, and then another time, and then another time. It's frustrating. She got 9 years. She only served 7. She was released, I think, in 1992, where eventually she would change her name. She moved out of state, and I don't know where her whereabouts are to this day. In terms of motives, it is one of the strangest ones I've ever seen. A teenage girl didn't want to be considered or called weird at school, and that was enough to make her murder someone. But what was her motive for luring her out in the first place? That's my question. What was she initially planning to do? If murder wasn't the plan, what was the plan? But in the end, it doesn't really matter. I mean, what happened, happened. She killed someone. And wherever she is out there, people may not know who she is, but she is still living with that for the rest of her life, that she ended a child's life. She was a child too, yes, but she ended the life of another child. While Bernadette, she got a slap on the wrist basically, and she was still extremely young when she was released from prison. She got a chance to, get married, maybe, have kids, maybe eventually have grandkids, and she gets to watch all those kids grow up. She gets to live. She gets to live free. And Kirsten does not. Kirsten died at the age of 15 on someone's front lawn after being stabbed 5 times. That's not fair. That's not justice. But what do I know? I'm just some guy. Kirsten Costas was just a beloved member of this school and of this community. She was just a teenage girl, she was popular, well-liked. Again, she was just a teenage girl, she never got a chance to graduate high school or do any of those other things that Bernadette would eventually get to do. And that's sad. That's really, really sad, and that's extremely tragic. And in the end, Kirsten Costas didn't really get the justice that she very rightfully deserved.
What do you got, Sandra?
Please help me. His name is Jon.
Jon what?
Garner.
Excuse me, man, back up on me. He's still warm.
Is he alive?
No, ma'am. Come on, sweetie. Come on.
Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jon Garner. Viewer discretion is advised. The video I played at the beginning was actual police body cam footage from January 2nd, 2018. Maypearl, Texas police were called with this 911 call.
What is your emergency?
I need somebody to come. I need the police. I need an ambulance. My husband's been shot.
Okay, what happened there?
There was a man in here. And he shot him. And he told me not to call the police.
And do you know where the male subject went?
No, I was in the bathroom. And he told me to sit down and count to 100 and not to call the police until I got to 100. He said if I called y'all before he reached 100, he'd come back and kill me. Please hurry. I think he's still alive. He's making noises, please.
55-year-old Sandra Garner had called police to state that her husband had been shot, and this happened while they were both asleep in bed. Just hours before, Jon and Sandra Garner had celebrated their 18-year anniversary. When they met, she'd already been divorced a couple of times, and she had 2 kids. By all accounts, Jon was a really wonderful stepdad to her kids. Jon was never described as someone who was abusive or anything like that. He seemed to be a relatively good dude. There was one aspect that people would point out during the investigation. Jon may have had some enemies. You see, Jon was, I guess, a manager at a packaging plant. And according to some people, Jon loved firing people. I know that sounds strange, but it's something I guess he was totally cool with doing. He got threats. He made a lot of people mad, and this would cause him to purchase a lot of guns, and it said that in the household there was a gun in basically every room. Jon was a doting husband. Sandra had been diagnosed as having multiple sclerosis back in 2014, and Jon took really good care of her. She said that the two of them had a really awesome relationship. They absolutely loved each other. They were always doing things together. They traveled. She said that he was all she had, and she loved every minute of having him. Her 911 call felt real. It sounded real and authentic. The video I showed at the beginning of her, reactions during when the police arrived at the house, again, seemed very real. Did not seem like a performance or anything like that, at least to me. But then here's where it gets really strange. So Sandra tells police that she had a conversation, basically, with the person who killed her husband. She said she was sound asleep when all of a sudden there were the sounds of gunshots. She woke up, she saw a tall white man standing above her husband. The man was wearing a mask. He had a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She said she could still tell that he was a white male. Sandra was begging for her life, and I guess he, according to her, said to her, "Shut up, I'm not here to kill you, I'm here to kill him." The guy said that Jon was his former employer and that Jon had fired him. That this guy lost everything. He lost his wife, he lost his kids because they got a divorce. He lost his income, he lost everything in his life because of Jon Garner. This assailant, this murderer, told Sandra, "I know he has money somewhere in the house because he always bragged about it. Take me to that money." And so Sandra brings him to the closet and she opens the safe for him and gives him the money. This was roughly $18,000 in cash. He then tells her, "Stay in the bathroom, count to 100. If you call 911 before you reach 100 or before I escape, I will come back and I will shoot you." And then that's when the 911 call is made. After that time frame is passed, the guy is long gone, and police are unsure of this story. Police would interview someone else who was in the house from time to time, Sandra's son, Wesley Miller. He was very quick to suggest who actually did this. He said his mom killed Jon. He even told police, "I know where you can find the murder weapon." He tells police, well, they have dogs. The dogs didn't bark. How come? How did this person get in the house? There's no forced entry. He said for someone to sneak up on Jon is very unusual. He said he doesn't buy it. He told police that Sandra used to keep a gun in her purse and that Wesley had always seen the gun in her purse. Sometimes she kept it underneath the seat of her vehicle. He tells police that that is where the gun is right now. It's underneath the seat of her car. Police check her car. They look under the seat. They don't see anything. There's no gun. There's no gun anywhere in her car. They collect 49 pistols and 12 rifles from the house. Every single gun they owned was accounted for, save for one. A .38 caliber revolver that Jon had purchased Sandra sometime before this. It was a .38 caliber that shot Jon. They also felt it was strange that this killer used a gun that was from the house that he broke into. He didn't bring his own gun. He had this plan of getting a mask and wearing gloves and basically getting the money from the safe. He knew all of this. He planned all of it, but except he didn't have his own gun, and so he thought he would just take one from the house. Seems odd. Anyway, after police found out there was no gun in her car, they go back to Wesley and say, there's no gun there. He says, that can't be. You must have missed it. Check again, because that gun is definitely there. So police the next day go back to her car. Lo and behold, underneath the front seat in a bag is a .38 caliber revolver. Was not there the previous search. Suddenly it's there after Wesley says it should be there. Why would Sandra put it back in her car? They confirmed that that was the gun that shot and killed Jon Garner. They found gunshot residue on Sandra's arm. Now, it was only a couple of tiny specks. Later on, her defense team says, well, she could have gotten those when she was doing CPR, because she did do CPR on the 911 call. Also, she was literally next to him in bed. She was bound to get a couple of specks of gunshot residue on her. Police also found that on her iPad, on Sandra Garner's iPad, there was a link titled 16 Ways to Kill Somebody and Not Get Caught, and that link was clicked. They found another search that said, How to Kill Someone in Their Sleep. This was her iPad, so she was arrested and she was charged with the murder of Jon Garner. Here's a couple of things that were brought up at her trial. Her hands were never bagged by police the night of the murder. Her car was never dusted for fingerprints. Even by Wesley's own account, that Jon and Sandra typically were in bed, passed out by 9:30 or maybe 10 p.m. The searches on the iPad were done between 11 p.m. and midnight. The iPad had no password protection, meaning anybody could have logged into it. When it was logged into, by Wesley's own admission, he was also in the house that night when that search was done, which was done just a few days prior to the murder. Sandra's defense would say Wesley Miller is the killer. He was so quick to turn on his own mom. He said the gun would be in a certain spot even though it wasn't found there. And then after he says that it should be there, then suddenly they find it. But then I asked the question, if he said it was there and he put it there, how come it wasn't there, right? That kind of confuses me a little bit. Wesley, however, they were able to prove that he had a motive. He was broke. He had no money. He also told people that he thought he was in Jon Garner's will. He wasn't. Sandra had no motive. They could not discover a motive. There were no affairs. They had a very good relationship. She needed Jon because she had a medical issue that he was doing everything in his power to help her, Jon. And now why would she get rid of that person? The gunshot residue really was very weak evidence. The fact of the matter is the prosecution failed to prove that she fired the fatal shot. I do ask the question, though, if she had this lengthy, almost 10-minute conversation with the killer, and she said at one point she saw his eyes. When the flashlight hit his eyes, she saw them, and she said, I didn't recognize those eyes. And also, if it was her own son, how would she not know it's his voice? That's my other question. So, at the trial, Sandra Garner is found not guilty, and she is acquitted. They just did not have the physical evidence. They did not have a motive. There was no money trail. There was nothing to show that she actually did this. But it's just very strange that if this was her own son, how did she not pick up on the signs? Was he using a fake voice or something? I don't know. Didn't recognize her own son's eyes, his build. It seems, I don't know. And then she, at this point in her life, says, I do not speak to my son ever because he did me dirty. He did me wrong. They asked her, do you still love your son? And she flat out said, not like I used to. No, he did me really, really wrong. But that's where it's at. Wesley Miller, to this day, has not been charged with connections to this murder. Nobody else has. Sandra Garner is acquitted. She cannot be charged again. She cannot go on trial again for his murder. And that is where it stands. And so, if you by chance have any information on the murder of Jon Garner that could help lead to an arrest, please contact the police in Maypearl, Texas, with any information you have. You don't have to say who you are. You just have to say what you know. Because Jon Garner still has not gotten justice. And Jon Garner deserves justice. But that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. Please subscribe if you are new to the channel. That would be wonderful. I would appreciate you. You're amazing people. I love all of yous. At any rate, high five, bud. That was a side five. Side five. Side five. Side five. Let's make it a new thing. Hey, side five. Boom. Done. That's more like a slap. Kind of. It's like you're just slapping someone's... Oh, I guess I'm still awkward even in these impromptu ways of very awkward finishing a video. I'm awkward finishing everything out. Oh, wait, what? What? Anyway, okay. A simple bye would have been fine, Mike, but it's already way past that point, so...